On today's episode of the SSPX Podcast, we'll continue our Apologetics Series by diving into the fraught world of the Inquisitions. And it all starts with one basic concept. How should the church deal with heresies? What does a trial for a crime against truth look like? And what should it look like? Throughout history, were there abuses of this process by the church or by civil authorities? Or is it all completely exaggerated? There's lots of info that Dr. Rao will help us uncover in the next hour or so. You can find notes to all of these episodes at sspxpodcast.com/apologetics, as well as all of our previous episodes. There as well, you can find a link to help support this project. This is free to listen to, as well as all of the resources that we're posting. But if you can help with a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation, you'll be making sure that we can continue this work of producing good Catholic content on a regular basis. Now let's join Dr. John Rao for episode number 22 of the Apologetics Series. Dr. Rao, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us on this next episode. Was still thinking about the Crusades episode, fascinated by all the history, everything that went on behind the scenes that we just don't know much about. But today we're going to look at another event or series of events that took place primarily, I guess, in Spain, and that is the Inquisition. So I guess the Inquisition happened because there was a problem of heresy in the Catholic Church or within the Catholic Church, surrounding the Catholic Church during this period. Can you give us kind of the overall view of where this started?
Well, actually, there's three segments of Inquisition history. The first of them starts out with the medieval Inquisition, which is something that deals with an awareness on the part of the church, particularly when you get into the middle of the 1100s, that there is a widespread heresy that has to be dealt with. And it came as a real shock what it is that people who were first engaged in it, in the discovery, when they became aware of what the extent of this was. And that led to, in what we call the medieval Inquisition, a series of ad hoc commissions, in effect, being sent out underneath the control of papal legates, in which first the Cistercians and then the Franciscans and Dominicans, but primarily the Dominicans, were involved. And that has a very great impact from the 1100s down into the 1300s, when it pretty much fades away from the picture, even though there are certain heretical problems that have to be dealt with as well. The second one, which is perhaps the most popular target of people who are anti-Catholic, is the Spanish Inquisition. And that's a quite different phenomenon that was set up in 1478 with papal approval, and which continues onwards with a break because of the French Revolution down ultimately to 1834. And then the third one is the Roman Inquisition, which is set up in 1542 by Pope Paul III because of the awareness of Protestant influence that was having an impact in Italy. All right, so that there are three distinct, very, very important manifestations of what we refer to as the Inquisition.
Okay. So this all came about because of heresies. And as we know, studying the history of the church, there were heresies that propped up from the very beginning all the way until the present moment. But was this a particular period of time where there were a lot of heresies, or was there a problem with heresies within the church before this period that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, after the initial period of the first ecumenical councils, when various problems of Arianism and then the Christological issues were dealt with, and then the iconoclast heresy, there is really a kind of calm that hits the scene, both in East and West. There's one minor outbreak of a very, very intellectual form of heresy just for a brief period in the West in the early 800s, but it doesn't really amount to anything. But what happens in particular is that in both the East and the West, there is the discovery in the late 1000s in the East already, early 1100s perhaps, in the East as well, and then in the course of the 1100s, of the way in which there has been spreading a form of Gnosticism, the form of Gnosticism that we know as Manichaeanism, which was something alarming in both the Eastern Empire and then in the West in particular, Well, there's certain manifestations of this in the Rhineland area and the area of the lowlands, but primarily in southern France, southwestern France, and northern Italy. It's dealing with this and then trying to distinguish what it is that is taking place there from certain other developments which are not at first heretical, but have a certain heretical manifestation of it. That the first medieval Inquisition comes into operation. We can talk more about that if you want, but in any case, that's the background there.
Okay, so what was the heresy of the Manichaeans? What did they profess?
Well, first of all, Manichaeanism is a form of the broader heresy or vision. You might it's broader than a Christian phenomenon or an anti-Christian phenomenon that we call Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is something which has certain divisions within it. There are, in effect, moderate forms of what's called Gnosticism, and then more intense forms of it. But generally speaking, what Gnosticism is something focused on the idea that the created world is the product of something evil. In its more absolute form, it's as though there are two principles at work, a good principle and an evil principle. In its more moderate form, there's just a kind of falling off from the good principle that leads to the creation of the world around us. But the main thrust of it is that the world that we're dealing with now is evil. It is a deceptive world. There's no way that an individual soul can, in any pure fashion, come to terms with this. And what you have to do is you have to find a way to escape from this world of evil in order that the little particle within your soul that remains or yearns to be pure can join up with what it is that's good, that's beyond creation, that is different than creation, that's an enemy in the more absolute forms of Gnosticism, of creation in general. And so it has no possibility in any of its forms of coming to terms with a religion that's based upon the creation of the world by a good God, and with the evil that exists in the world not having anything to do with that good God, and nevertheless with that good God saving the creation that has gone astray through merely human action, and redeeming it and transforming it and utilizing it. Now, the thing that makes Manichaeanism particularly problematic, it's the product of a Persian figure, kind of mysterious in some respects, Persian figure from the 3rd century, maybe late 2nd century, but 3rd century primarily, who when he preached his form of Gnosticism, argued that what was necessary was to evangelize this teaching all across the globe in a universal way, with a plan for evangelization that did not involve a head-on attack against all of the various religions or cultural situations where the Manichaeans were going to enter, but a plan of evangelization which sought to, well, we would use the term deconstruct what it is that you're dealing with. Find a way to grapple onto it and reinterpret it, to use it for your own purposes. So, to give you the example of the way in which this would involve, let's say, both the Judaic and then the Christian traditions with Scripture, what you do is you don't reject the scriptures of the Jews or the scriptures of the Christians. What you do is you reinterpret them, and you begin that reinterpretation with the reinterpretation of the whole account of the fall. Because in the Manichaean understanding of things, the temptation of Eve and then Adam is really an uncovering by the force that wants to lead you away from the deceptions of what the Jews and the Christians consider to be the good God and his good creation, so that by eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the temptation to do this is a good thing. It's a good thing. and everything else is interpreted in relation to what happens. So that what you have with the fall is the punishment of this evil force responsible for the creation of these people who have been given an inkling of the fact that there's a way out of this mess, which is not that either the Jews or the Christians consider to be the way out of it. And you have to reinterpret everything on this basis. The other aspect of all Gnostic approaches and the Manichaean approach as well is that the people who know the truth about the evil of creation and are going to lead you away from it through their reinterpretive work here. The knowledge of this is the knowledge of certain very, very, a very elite group of awakened, in effect, prophetic figures. And the reason why we use the term Gnosticism to describe the whole vision is because that word indicates it's a Greek word for knowledge, and there is a special secret esoteric knowledge that this elite group has that they have to transmit to a population which is steeped in the evil of creation, and which they are able to lead them away from because they have through their knowledge undertaken this process of purification. Which enables them to be able to be the custodians of this esoteric truth.
So this is a heresy that's starting to spread in this region around this time. What was the response of the church? The church obviously has to uphold the truth, has to make sure that heresy is not being spread. So what were they going to do about it, or what did they do about it?
Well, I mean, it first made its appearance in the immediate time period after Mani, when Mani was living, because the whole period of the Roman Empire from the late 100s onwards is spiritually very, very troubled. And the Manichaeans made their penetration into the Roman Empire at that time. And what's of interest is the fact that, and it plays a role, by the way, later on with the Inquisition, what's of interest is the fact that the Roman Empire saw, just as the Persian Empire saw, that the teaching of the Manichaeans as a form of Gnosticism was dangerous to the state as well, because the state is a force for evil insofar as it claims that it can create order and justice in this terribly corrupt created world. So that the state reacted badly against the Manichaeans, but so did the Christian church. And the great figure that can easily be mentioned in the fight against the Manichaeans the first time around is St. Augustine. St. Augustine was tempted by Manichaeanism and then rejected it. And then in rejecting it, became one of the great fighters against it. And it was pretty much through the state efforts to try to destroy this, even when the state in Rome was anti-Christian. And then the Christian church's efforts to destroy it when it became an accepted institution, it was pretty much put down and went underground. And then what happens is it never went completely dead, let's say, in the easternmost regions of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So it pops up there again in the 900s and 1000s. And one initial reason for its spread was that in order to fight it, remember when we were talking about the Crusades, I noted that the Eastern Roman Empire went on the warpath again in the 900s and 1000s, and it expanded eastward, and it encountered a lot of these the survivors of this mentality there. And to break their power, what they did is they divided them up, and they deported some of them to the far western end of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and that is in present-day Bulgaria. So that they developed another center of this in Bulgaria. And then what happened is that people who were evangelists for this vision, they started traveling westward into Italy and into present-day southern France in particular, and apparently some of them even up the Rhine into the lowlands, but it's primarily northern Italy and southern France that they go. And the people who were playing this role of evangelist were people who were merchants, and at times people who got engaged in the expanded merchant lines that were developed as a result of the Crusades and Venice's and Genova's efforts in serving as agents for transporting both crusaders and goods east and west. So they maneuvered into this region, and then what happened is they had debates because these different factions were active there. The ones who had a somewhat more moderated form of this idea of the corruption of the universe, and the others who had this absolute idea of there being a good principle which had nothing to do with creation whatsoever, and a totally evil principle responsible for creation. And then by the time you get into the early 1100s, what happens is that the most organized branch of this more absolute vision of what needed to be taught went on a special kind of missionary trip into northern Italy and into southern France, and organized the Manichaean Church in an extremely, extremely sophisticated way, so that for someone who was not aware of what it was that was happening here, when they encountered a Manichaean bishop and a Manichaean parish, a Manichaean councils, because there are meetings of these groups as well, it would have been hard for a lot of people to distinguish the outward structure from that of the Catholic Church. But the church was aware that there was something going on here, and particularly became aware of it by the 1140s. I mean, people like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, an archbishop in Milan, became aware of what was happening here, and then various other figures as well. And then they realized that they were dealing with gradually the church realizes it's dealing with a violently anti-Christian force, violent in the sense of opposing everything that Christianity stands for, with its idea of the need to redeem nature and correct it of its flaws, and correct it of its flaws by means of a message that everybody shared in common, that there was no elite group that knew some special truths that could only be transmitted to others if they were given an absolute obedience and then went through the kind of strange purification process that was taught by this group. And as a result of realizing that there was this parallel organization that was at work, it began to feel that it had to do something drastic to deal with it, as did various state officials that came into contact with it or who were made aware of it. There's one other problem that has to be mentioned in this regard, and it's a problem that there is a serious effort made to deal with, especially when you get underneath the reign of Pope Innocent III, and that is that there was stirred up by the whole Orthodox reform movement within the church that was very much promoted from various monastic centers, of which, as we mentioned yesterday, the one coming out of Cluny was the most important, but there's a number of others. Also, there was a real drive that then the papacy took charge of by the time you got into the middle of the 1000s to reform a corrupt clergy and a corrupt church, in which the teaching, not so much the teachings of the church, but the actual canons for behavior were not being followed. And so a real spirit of the need of purification of the clergy and of the church as a whole was promoted for Orthodox reasons. But that stirring up of that spirit and the awareness that much of the clergy was corrupt also developed a kind of popular anti-clericalism that worked in tandem with the organized Orthodox reform movement, but could get out of hand as well. And some elements within the church, particularly among educated or well-off lay figures in places like France and present-day France and Italy became very much convinced of the need for a spirit of poverty and the need for a clergy which was poor and a laity which was poor in spirit as well. Probably the most famous figure from among laymen who was involved in this was a man whose name was Valdez, who was a rich merchant, who gives birth to the movement which is named after him, the Valdensian movement. And one segment of this is radical and can veer off into a total rejection of all of the visible aspects of the church, including the sacraments as visible signs of invisible grace. Whereas another aspect of it is just simply a kind of very intense movement seeking to encourage people to have an attitude towards riches which is detached and maybe even live a life of poverty. And that aspect of it is something which is picked up, of course, by St. Francis and St. Dominic. And Pope Innocent III is going to actually approve certain groups that stemmed out of this original movement. But for people panicked by the discovery of the Manichaeans, there was a difficulty at times for them being able to distinguish between the Manichaeans and then those people who they thought maybe were hiding with their ideas of poverty, the absolute truth. Well, one other element too that brings this down to very specific groups. Gnosticism is the broad term. Manichaean is the term for followers of Mani who tried to grapple hold of existing religious movements and ideas and then just reinterpret them and use them for their own purposes. And then in the West, in Western Christianity, the Manichaeans are known to us more specifically with the term in the southern part of France, Albigensians. The Albigensians are the men of Albi. It's just a focus around one of the important cities where these people were located. And then also the term Catharist is used. That is used often very much in northern Italy and some parts of central Italy where they were active as well. And that takes that term Catharism from the Greek word for indicating a purification. Because the whole idea of the elite guiding this is that the people who were hearers of their message had to be in some way saved through the purified lives of the more perfect ones that the elite represented, and then be guided towards that purification under the best of circumstances as well. So, again, Albigensian Catharist is a more specific term of the Manichaeanism manifested in the West, which is itself a narrower term for this broader vision of Gnosticism. And what we've got around us now, with all of these esoteric teachings of the transhumanists and posthumanists and like, is another form of Gnosticism that their elite teaches and tries to foist on everybody else. And if they can, in a Manichaean way, doing so by grappling hold of existing religious forces and reinterpreting them in their own way. But it reaches a real peak in the West of concern from the 1140s down through until pretty much the middle of the 1200s, by which time it has been pretty much brought under control. Although there's sort of outcroppings of it in different ways, sometimes not as organized, that continue in the late 1200s and 1300s as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you're the Pope at this time. How do you get a handle on it? How do you stop this kind of surreptitious, heresy from continuing to spread like it has been? Well,
the first real efforts to deal with it, which are the ones that bring the church authorities into it, especially the papal authorities into it. The first responses to it were popular and state reactions. Now, when you're talking about popular reactions, you're generally going to be talking about mob reaction. Sometimes it is a local bishop that is aware of something untoward taking place here, but who deals with it in a kind of popular way as well, often with the aid of the local population. And when you have popular reactions to something, which might even be a popular reaction based upon a good gut feeling, it can be vigilante in character and not particularly discerning in terms of who it strikes against or how it strikes against it. And then when you're talking about the state, the reason why this phenomenon develops the most in southern France, southwestern France, and then northern Italy is because the political situation in these areas was more chaotic. But when there was an awareness of it in areas where the political authorities were a little bit more solidly established, then they, reacted very strongly at an early time as well. And when state authorities that reacted against this did so, what they did is they did so with a reference to what they were learning much more about. Interestingly enough, the church was the first force that learned much more about this, but the state authorities were learning much more about it as well. And that is a much greater knowledge of old Roman law, Roman law, only bits of it had survived and often mingled in with a local Germanic law or Norman law or whatever, and customary law of various local places. But there's a much deeper knowledge of Roman law by the time you get into the 1000s. And like with everything else that people in the Middle Ages learned from the ancient world, they treated it with an awe that veered into the exaggerated adulation. As though you could not criticize any aspect of what was handed down from the ancients. And they rediscovered the fact that the Roman state had punished these particular ideas, particularly Manichaean ideas, very, very severely, ultimately with the punishment of burning people who were connected with it. So that they automatically leapt to the conclusion that what you must do is you must grab hold of these people and then severely punish them. And then if you're combining this together with a methodology, procedures that are not exactly the most just, it can really get out of hand. But there's a lot of pressure on the church authorities to do something about this because populations that reacted, not all of them do. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon why the places in southern France and northern Italy, why there were people who did react. And there's a kind of specific clientele down there that we ought perhaps to make mention of. I don't want to take up all the time with this if you need to get onto the Spanish Inquisition as well. But this is the first manifestation of this. But the population really wants to see action. It gets angry at the church authorities for not doing something. Like in a way, like we get angry at the church authorities for not doing something now. So in any case, what ended up happening is that there was a council. There was the Third Lateran Council. That I think it's the Third Lateran Council. I can't remember whether it was Second Council of Lyon or Third Lateran Council. By the time you get into the 1170s. That talks about the need to deal with this problem in a way that will involve also the civil authorities being called up because of the fact that it has an impact what these people are preaching on social authority as a whole, and also because of the fact that the church authorities don't feel comfortable about administering physical punishments. So that given the fact that the civil authorities had reason to be concerned about this, what you would want to do is to have any kind of physical punishments be handed over to them. And then there was a meeting of Pope Lucius III with the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1184. And there was another bit of legislation that was developed for active pursuit of trying to figure out who these people were and what they were up to. And it's out of that development that you then begin to get more and more of the idea of the need for the papacy to send out specific legates in order to investigate what's going on. And now we're getting into the name Inquisition because it's an inquiry commission. And so papal legates are going to begin to be sent out. And this is especially the case underneath Innocent III. And then they're going to need to have people who aid them in inquiring about what is going on, who is thinking what, who is guilty of what, how to make a distinction between some of these who are just poor in spirit and others who have got this totally anti-Christian idea and who have organized a parallel church to promote it. And then what you wanted to do is to get men who were considered to be pure in their own lives to be able to investigate this so that they could not be accused of being examples of the corrupt clergy that the whole reform movement had been fighting against since the late 900s. And at first they started with Cistercians, but then what happens is St. Dominic, who coming up from Spain, traveling through that area, coming into contact with these people, gained a greater awareness of what was happening there. Dominicans were seen to be the ones who would be much more suited for this kind of inquiry. And then Franciscans as well, but it was always much more the case that the Dominicans felt at home with it. The area that St. Francis comes from, Assisi, was a place that became a center for Manichaean Catharist activity. Even the mayor of Assisi, when Francis was active, seems to have been a member of the whole group there. And St. Francis was never part of an inquiry committee, an Inquisition committee like the Dominicans were, or for that matter, other Franciscans were. But he understood what these people were all about, and it was his understanding of it that led him to effectively fight against it. And just because he understood, for example, that one of the things that these people were most horrified by was childbirth. Because if you have a child, you're bringing another evil body into the evil world.
Oh, wow.
And so the Manichaeans, the Albigensians, the Catharists are very much anti-childbirth. They'd rather see the extirpation of the human race because it's all evil. They want the existing souls to free. They often call it a spark, to fly out of the body and the sensual to be able to purify itself. And if you look at a history of, contraception and abortion, a lot of the initial work in a popular way with this is traced back to the Manichaeans in Western Europe at this time. And St. Francis discovered the best tool to teach the population the difference with the Orthodox Christian position, the creche. That's why he invented the creche. The creche and the Christmas manger scene were an anti-Manichaean measure of St. Francis. Wow. It worked, and it worked very, very successfully. All right, so that there's this major then effort. And part of that major effort as well was also the famous Albigensian Crusade that is called by Innocent III after his initial legate, a Cistercian by the name of Pierre de Castelnau, was murdered in the area that he was investigating. And then Innocent called a crusade. And there are things that happen in this crusade, once again, because of the fact that you're going to be dragging soldiery of various political forces who stand to gain if they can overthrow the political forces that were supporting the Manichaeans in southwestern France, that involved a number of bloody massacres. That was able to then fuel a lot of the whole anti-Catholic, anti-Inquisition Protestant promoters of the whole black legend against Spain. When you get down to the the next stage of this whole issue later on. All right, so that ironically, by the way, when I mentioned that in various ways the whole movement was broken as an organized force, in various ways it was broken. Ironically, the last bastions of the Manichaean forces that were so active in the 11 and 1200s in France and in Italy was right in the area where I run my summer program every year on Lake Garda. The last bastion of them was in this town called Desenzano, which is the train station, which is at the bottom of the lake. So it's kind of ironic that we that we're over there now doing something which is totally anti-Gnostic and anti-Manichaean in character.
So we have the state, we have these local state controlled militias, so to speak, or civic organizations that are rediscovering Roman law and saying, hey, they burned they burned these Gnostics at the stake. We're going to do the same thing. Right. Now, did the Pope at the time, was he okay with the state taking control like this and doing this sort of thing? Obviously the church is going to be involved with trying to figure out who is a heretic, kind of like how they've done all throughout history and how they should do. But was the church okay with the physical punishment and the death of these heretics?
Well, you see, this was a problem from the very beginning. And in effect, the whole idea, well, to begin with, the church from the very outset was not happy about the idea of being involved in any kind of physical punishments. I mean, in the early church, it was always an awareness that you had to throw heretics out. You had to throw them out. But the church was hesitant to have any kind of physical punishments against anybody that was a heretic after, let's say, for example, the legalization of the church. And there was a quite violent reaction against the state involvement in punishing a heretic named Priscillian in the 300s, the late 300s. There is a movement that argues that the state has the right to punish heretics who are promoting ideas that are dangerous for the civil society. That is promoted in Africa because of the Donatist heresy in the late 300s and the early 400s. And St. Augustine, somewhat hesitatingly, ends up approving of the idea that the state has grounds for being involved in this if it is disruptive to the social order. But then when you get into the period we're talking about right now, it's clear that the church authorities are nervous about all of this. And step by step, what they're going to do is they're going to admit that you need to find out who these people are. The state has a certain right to punish heresy, which has an impact socially. And of course, the church authorities are themselves in awe of Roman law and the fact that Roman law allowed for rather harsh punishments in this regard as well. And bit by bit, it's going to also even allow the idea of torture being involved, but under very, very specific rules. One, only if the people engaged in the Inquisition are almost 100% sure that the person that they're going to, the term is apply the question to, is guilty. Secondly, it can only be done once. And thirdly, it can't be done in any way that actually permanently harms an individual's limb, much less his life. But the state is more and more active in this regard. And you might know that by the time you get into the 1200s, and in particular in the battle of church and state that involves various popes against the Emperor Frederick II, the battling of church and state gets more and more bitter. And Pope Gregory IX decided in 1231, which was a period of another outbreak of concern about the influence of these heretics, that he had to organize the whole of the procedure much, much more clearly. So it's really Gregory the Ninth, who is a canon lawyer expert as well, who sets up the procedures to be followed much, much more clearly. Very much procedures that are going to be maintained really in the future. But it remains the case that in the 1200s, 1300s, whatever's remains of this in the 1400s, that inquisitorial procedures are only utilized by these ad hoc teams of inquisitors who go out with papal approval in areas which are affected by heresy. And there's no permanent structure of any kind here. The bad press that the medieval Inquisition gets is a bad press that is primarily connected with excesses of the soldiery at the time of the Albigensian Crusade, and then a couple of inquisitors at the time when Gregory the Ninth establishes these procedures much more clearly. One man, for example, in particular, a man named Conrad of Marburg in the 1200s, who's quite exaggerated in his methods and is murdered as a result of this. Another man who's known, I think it's Robert Le Bougre. He's called Le Bougre. That means the term bugger was a term that was a popular translation of the word Bulgar, which was associated with the evangelical work for creating this problem. And Robert Le Bougre was a convert from Manichaeanism to Orthodox Catholicism, and then he became an inquisitor because he knew the territory, so to speak. But he was rather rough, and so as a consequence, what they did, which is not the norm at all, became, as usual, the cause célèbre that was focused on. And people in more recent times have done a lot of studies about just how many people were involved in let's say burnings or brutal imprisonments and the like. And what that's yielded is an indication that you're talking about outbursts in isolated areas, sometimes involving a military action. There's a place called Montségur in I think the early 1300s, the last outpost, or maybe 1200s, forget the exact date, the last outpost of these people in southern France, where there was an actual military expedition, and then there were murders, and then under Conrad of Marburg and a few others. But generally, when you take the whole picture, you're talking about very small numbers under generally very moderate inquisitorial activity on the basis of Roman law procedures, which involve certain procedures which we, more familiar with Anglo-Saxon law, are considered to be somewhat harsh. The witnesses are heard secretly. You're not confronted with your witnesses.
Sure.
But there are certain protections for the ones who are accused as well. Still, there are procedures there which are, when you get into, let's say, the Roman Inquisition, the permanent Roman Inquisition from 1542 onwards, you're not going to find the same kind of abuses perpetrated as a result of.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of parallels there with the same sort of stories we heard with the Crusades.
Right.
A lot of people getting involved who were overly exuberant in the roles that they were playing.
Right, and self-interested, because there's property that you can confiscate as a result of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so then that's the medieval Inquisition. Let's move into the Spanish Inquisition, which is, again, probably the most popular, so to speak, of the Inquisitions used against Catholics. Is there a connection to the Manichaean heresy there, or is that something totally separate?
No, there's not a connection to the Manichaean heresy. The Spanish Inquisition that's created underneath Ferdinand and Isabella is created, first off, with the argument that there are problems with, as Spain was moving to take over the rest of the peninsula from the Moors, that there were problems with converted Jews and converted Moors. All right, and you get this famous Morisco argument that the people who had converted from among the Jews and had converted from among the Moors were not really converted. And as a result of that, they were what we would call fifth columnists in the Christian ranks. But the problem with the Spanish Inquisition from the very beginning is that it's something that is requested by the monarchs. It's approved of by Pope Sixtus IV, who is engaged in all kinds of political shenanigans of one sort or another back in Italy at the time, anyway. And it's an Inquisition which, even though it does involve as the figures who are the inquisitors and then the Grand Inquisitor himself, clerics and Dominicans to a large degree, it's underneath the control of the state. It's underneath ultimately the supreme control of the state. There's a supreme council that guides it, and everybody knows that even though in theory even the monarch himself is subject to the Inquisition and the Grand Inquisitor. In fact, you can see a popular depiction of this in the opera Don Carlo of Verdi, where there's a confrontation between the Grand Inquisitor and King Philip II, and the king laments the fact that even he has to give in to the Grand Inquisitor. But
Wow.
that's a fraud. That's a fraud. That's not the case at all. And Rome, from the very beginning, has got problems with the Spanish Inquisition. There's constant complaints to Rome about the Spanish Inquisition being really primarily an agent of the government. Its most famous inquisitor, the man who really puts it in order the most, is a man whose name is Torquemada, who was active underneath Ferdinand and Isabella. But it continues onwards, and it's a constant source of problems for Rome. The Spanish were in charge, obviously, in vast areas of Europe and then the New World, and they tried to export the Spanish Inquisition into these areas. They exported into the New World, parts of the New World at least. They tried to extend it into their holdings in Italy, but they were fought off in Italy. They expanded into their holdings in the lowlands, and that is an interesting matter because it ends up being one of the elements of intense Spanish control over the lowlands that gave birth to the revolt against Spanish control that led ultimately to the separation of the northern part of the Spanish lowlands that becomes the independent Netherlands, the Dutch Republic, and then ultimately a monarchy as well. And it's through that revolt of the people in the lowlands against the Spanish that much of the activity, that much of the argument that's made together with the aid of the English, who were allies of them in their revolt against Spain, that puts together the arguments that form what we call the Black Legend, the whole anti-Spanish Black Legend. And again, here, what's going to be done is to build up on complaints about the Spanish Inquisition that the papacy in Rome had quite strongly as well, but to turn it into an illustration of how the Roman Church as a whole, with Spain as its agent, was guilty of mass murders. And here too, even with the Spanish Inquisition, although there are abuses, but abuses that affect church officials as well. For example, the Archbishop of Toledo in the 1500s, the late 1500s, is accused by the Inquisition, also because of political problems that the Archbishop Carranza had with the king. He's accused of crimes, is imprisoned by the Inquisition, and Rome has to fight a battle to try to get control of the Archbishop of Toledo and bring him to Rome so that he can be dealt with more justly. So it's a wild force. But here too, again, the numbers are badly exaggerated, tremendously exaggerated, and what happens ultimately to enter into the arguments against the Inquisition in Spain is the fact, and I'm talking about when you get into the 1700s, for example, is the fact that the Spanish Inquisition's got control over a number of different realms of activity that state governments were trying to get control of from out of the hands of Protestant communities as well as Catholic communities, because they wanted to exercise a more rigorous discipline. And that includes control over marriage law and the like. And the Inquisition, in the eyes of the state, had a reputation for being much too lenient in character, They wanted to impose much more rigorous standards. So even in a place like Spain, where the government had a lot of control over the institution, it wanted more control still, but more control because the Inquisition was too lenient. And not harsh enough in imposing its state will.
Could you say then that the issues with the Spanish Inquisition, the excesses that did took place, even though, like you said, a lot of them are exaggerated, that was an issue not so much of Rome giving approval to them, but of Rome mismanaging the whole situation and not having enough control over what was happening in the peninsula at the time?
Well, I mean, again, the papacy in the late 1400s was not exactly strong. Right. And as a result of that, and it was also very much steeped in all kinds of political shenanigans involving trying to establish the papal states under firmer papal control, but often in conjunction with the particular family of the existing pope. And there's a lot of game playing and selling of what ought to be church rights out to whatever political authorities might be momentarily useful to them. It's interesting. This I always like there are a number of 19th century Catholic apologists who pointed this principle out. And I remember the argument of the French writer Louis Veuillot in particular in this regard. He said the problem is this. He said Catholics, are bad insofar as they do not rigorously follow their teachings and their moral principles. He said their opponents are bad the more that they do follow their teachings and their moral principles. And therefore, a lot of what happens in the Catholic Church that's bad is because of the fact that there's weak popes, weak bishops, not really enforcing the rules. Whereas when you get the people that are promoting principles that are anti-Christian in character, they're bad when they follow their principles fully and then can get a compliant church to go along with them.
Wow, it's a fascinating insight. So that's the Spanish Inquisition. Then we have one more we need to get through, which is the Roman Inquisition, and this is happening later.
The Roman Inquisition was founded in 1542 underneath Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III was, he's one of these popes in history that is always the inspiration of hope for all of us when we live in times of misery, because he was one of the main figures of the Farnese family, which was noted as being one of the most corrupt families in Italy. And he had been a cardinal for a good long while, who then is elected pope in the 1530s. And no one expected that this scion of a corrupt Italian family would be the man who would undertake all the various measures that were going to really cause the various reform elements that were already active in the church to be able to take root. Nobody expected that he would call a commission to study what the reasons were for the Protestant Reformation, a cardinalatial committee, which, by the way, its report said that the reason why this Reformation broke out is because of the miserable policies of the papacy to a large degree. And that's underneath a pope, that is commissioned. Nobody ever dreamed that he would do things like be the great defender of the Society of Jesus, allow that to be established, and any number of other reform groups. Nobody ever dreamed that he would be the man that would actually call a council, the Council of Trent. And what happened was that by 1542, Pope Paul III was aware of the fact that Protestantism was spreading in Italy. And as a result of that, what he needed to do was to make sure that this did not affect the peninsula. So he created now a permanent Roman Inquisition. And in fact, that Inquisition in Rome is conducted by the congregation, which is considered to be the most important from Paul III's reign onwards. It then starts to be given a run for the money by the Secretariat of State as you move along. And it's the Congregation of the Holy Office, or it's the Holy Office which has control of the Inquisition. And the procedures of the Inquisition are going to be always, pretty much the same. In that if you they're permanent now, so that you can have a permanent set of cardinal inquisitors who can preside over teams that will study things. But there are courts, there are procedures, there's a sense of exactly how you go about business, which is going to be applied uniformly wherever the Roman Inquisition and its writ are able to run. But of course, it's going to have a problem with Spain and Spanish possessions, where the Inquisition of Spain has been put in charge, that it's got to deal with. And we'll see another example of a problem here when we talk about Spanish colonization the next time around. And when you look at the Roman Inquisition is very, very, very mild in its approach towards things. It has a kind of wild outburst only in a brief period of time underneath Pope Paul IV, who is Pope in the 1550s for a short period of time, who is a very, very personally pure figure. He's got a few problems in the sense that he's a family. He's concerned about his family, his nephews and the like, and he turns a blind eye for a good period to their depredations. But then finally, when he hears about them, he strikes against them vigorously. But he was a very, very strong reforming pope. And what he did is he tried to utilize the Inquisition, not just against people guilty of heretical ideas, but guilty of moral crimes that he considered to be atrocious. And it's interesting in this regard that I'm starting to change my mind about whether it was an excess that he was involved in, because he considered the influence of the Sodomites to be so dangerous at his time period that he brought the trials of sodomy underneath the Inquisition. And I find this interesting because I always myself had thought, well, the moral issues are a separate matter. But when you look at the way in which all of the arguments of these people now are part and parcel of an entire vision of life, which is has sort of become an essential element in the creed of the whole Gnostic, global, transhumanist elite. I'm starting to think he was onto something there. Just as in effect underneath Savonarola, there was a reaction against sodomy as it had become established in the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent in Florence in the 1400s. But then there was a reaction against Paul IV after he died, and the next popes took that kind of issue, or all moral issues in general, outside of the purview of the Inquisition. The big cause célèbre of the Roman Inquisition is Giordano Bruno, who was burned in 1600. I'm not certain, but I think he was the only one that the Roman Inquisition ever did that to. And the reason why he was punished in Rome was because he escaped the authorities that wanted to get him in Venice. And he escaped to Venice from the authorities in various other places that had wanted to do it. And if you ever look at the views of Giordano Bruno, you know that he had to be shut up. Burning is, of course, another matter, but they had to be shut up. But it's mild the way the Roman Inquisition deals with things compared to any of the secular courts at the time. I mean, if you take the burning of Giordano Bruno as the one case of the Roman Inquisition and then compare it to what's being done under Elizabeth at the same time, you've got the example of a lax court in contrast.
Yeah. So we have the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, they both kind of overlap. When do these Inquisitions, as we kind of know them, when do they kind of cease to exist?
Well, the Roman Inquisition with Second Vatican Council in the aftermath, because it's the end of the Holy Office and then the creation of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is not even a congregation anymore. Now it's a dicastery.
Right. Dicastery, yeah. Because
Pope Francis is not interested in doctrine. At all, anyway. So that's in the 1960s that comes to an end. The Spanish Inquisition was abolished when the French came into Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, and then it was reestablished by the restored king of Spain after the Restoration, but then comes to an end entirely in 1834. But it was, I think, its last serious work, the Spanish Inquisition, in any way that has any kind of splashes in the early 1700s in the aftermath of the War of the Spanish Succession, which created a lot of political problems in Spain that the government was concerned for dealing with once more. But in general, the 1700s is a period of quite mild activity in this regard. One other instance, by the way, of looking at what the Roman Inquisition does compared to what states are doing at the time, could be given in the famous battle over the so-called Venetian interdict, which took place in 1606, 1607. The Republic of Venice was very much interfering with the clergy and then the rights of the church in a number of ways that were not unfamiliar in church-state battles throughout history. But what happened is that the Roman Church struck against the Republic of Venice underneath Pope Paul V in 1606, 1607. And when the Venetian state did not give in, what the Pope did is he imposed an interdict on Venice. So that means, therefore, that you cannot have any celebration of the sacraments except emergency baptisms and I think extreme unction as well. And there was still further reaction of the Venetian state, forcing priests to disobey Rome in this regard. But what's really interesting are the arguments that were being utilized by the government. And the arguments that were being utilized by the government were the arguments of the dominant political group in that period, who called themselves the Giovani, the young ones. And these young ones' political arguments were not just anti-Catholic, not just anti-Christian in general. They're totally nihilist in character, because they argue that, to begin with, they argue that it's God's will that that order be maintained only by the civil authorities. And you could say, well, okay, that's anti-Christian in character. But then it goes on to say that the political authorities are dealing with the realm of a human behavior, And there are no principles that can be utilized to guide human behavior, because human behavior is just simply the flux of uncontrollable passion. And as a result of that, it seems to indicate that the state can do whatever the state wants to do to control this flux of passionate behavior that cannot appeal to any kind of overriding principles of justice or good or evil in order to bring them under control. It's like Thomas Hobbes with his argument that you're just living in the jungle of a war of all against all, and you just simply need the jungle master of the Leviathan state to control everything. So that's the contrast to the Roman position based upon both faith and reason, giving you principles of justice that you have to enforce. And I'd rather be underneath the control of the Roman Inquisition if it came to a battle of these two forces rather than those of the Venetian state subject to these kinds of ideas.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. As we close, I'm looking at some of the notes you passed along to me ahead of time. You said, are there modern secular inquisitions? And that's an interesting question. Where did you want to go on that?
Well, just look around you. Just look around you. I mean, look around you now more than ever before. I mean, in the past, even 20 years ago, one might have referred to just simply the reality of the various forces controlling thought at the time of the French Revolution, or in the period of the Marxist Revolution, Marxist-Leninist revolutions. But now you see it manifest as the final result of liberalism. I mean, here you have an idea that claimed that you have to have freedom of thought, and that you could not possibly try to control thought because there has to be this battle of all ideas. And it's the agents of this very liberal principle now that have brought back, in a way that the Catholic Church would never have argued was feasible, the idea that error has no rights. And the errors that they're punishing are just simply everything that they have the will to punish. So that they have redefined science to mean whatever it is they want science to mean. They've now exiled, or are trying to exile, every kind of not just religious principle, but rational philosophical principle, on the basis of promoting an agenda which is clearly dominated by simply the will of this mishmash of different kinds of ideological and money forces that are trying to control every government around the globe. So we have an inquisition that is now doing things to fire people, ruin people's lives, medically control people, redefine what human beings are, while claiming to be the voice of a freedom greater that has ever existed in the history of the world. I mean, it's the biggest hypocrisy imaginable, and quite frankly, it's always been hypocritical. I mean, the forces that developed the legend around the Inquisition, building the obvious flaws and errors and crimes of the Inquisition into a generic argument against controlling anything religiously with civil effects at all. The very forces who created the arguments from among the Protestants were promoters of precisely the kinds of religious ideas that put the definition of what the faith is really into the hands of the will of whatever particular group is dominating the Protestant denomination that you're referring to. I mean, Luther himself is a nominalist who just simply argues that God's will has to be obeyed, and that will is obvious, but the obvious will of God is interpreted by a scripture that he interprets, right. and tries to destroy the interpretations of anybody who disagrees with him. And those who disagree with him do the same thing in their own fashion, in a way which has allowed all of them to work to create the kind of monstrous totalitarian understanding of imposition of the will of what I consider to be a union of criminals and maniacs. that smell victory now with the compliance of a lot of the forces that should be fighting against them, including our many of the officials of our own church.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, and it is interesting to see that through line exists in a completely different way nowadays.
Right.
Well, Dr. Rao, thank you so much. Next week, we'll be talking to you more about some of these topics. We have a few more of these, but next week in particular, we're going to be talking about Spanish colonization, which we touched on a little bit last week, but we're going to dive into a lot more detail. So looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Apologetics Series on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on this podcast. This will help to make sure more people can find this podcast and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.